Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. I'm still trying to process what happened to me last week. Every time I close my eyes, I'm transported back to that place. I'm a biology student and decided to do field research in Aokigahara, the famous suicide forest in Japan. I had read a lot about its unique vegetation, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience I had. I arrived early, around a.m., excited and full of expectations. My backpack was full of equipment, and I carried a notebook, ready to record every detail. The day was cloudy and a bit cold, but nothing unusual. As I entered the forest, the first thing that impressed me was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was a silence so deep that it seemed to absorb everything around it. Initially, I found the atmosphere fascinating. I could hear every leaf I stepped on, every branch I pushed aside. It seemed like the perfect environment for a thorough study. However, after about 2 hours of walking, I began to notice something strange. There was no wind, no animal sounds. Absolutely nothing but that oppressive silence. Gradually, I felt an increasing pressure in my ears, similar to the feeling of depressurization on an airplane. I tried to make some noises whistling, clapping just to break that disturbing quietness. But it was as if the sound didn't propagate correctly. It was muffled, distorted. It was at that moment that I really started to feel uneasy. There was something wrong there. Something I couldn't explain. I decided to continue a little more. After all, I was there to research. Little did I know what I was about to face. As I advanced deeper into the forest, the feeling of isolation intensified. The trees seemed to get denser, their twisted trunks forming almost hypnotic patterns. I lost track of time as I tried to focus on my research, noting the plant species I found. But it was hard to stay focused. That silence began to mess with my head. It was as if it were alive, watching me. At one point, I stopped to drink water and eat a sandwich I had brought. That's when I realized I could no longer hear my own chewing sounds. It was as if the silence had swallowed even that. I swallowed hard, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but all directions looked identical. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. A whisper so low that it was barely distinguishable from the silence. I strained my ears, trying to catch that sound again. And there it was, like a distant sigh brought by a non-existent wind. They weren't words, but something more primitive, almost like a lament. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind in the leaves, but there was no breeze at all. The sound seemed to come from all directions and nowhere at the same time. I took out my compass, determined to go back the way I had come, but the needle spun wildly, as if confused. It was at that moment that I realized I was lost, and something in the forest seemed not to want me to leave. Panic began to take over. I tried to stay calm, repeating to myself that I was a scientist, that there was a logical explanation for all of this. But logic seemed to have abandoned Aokigahara. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes seeming to come from behind a nearby tree, other times sounding distant, like an echo. I started walking faster, almost running, but I had the feeling of walking in circles. The shadows seemed to lengthen, although I couldn't see the sky through the dense canopy of trees to know if it was getting dark. My breathing became labored, and sweat ran down my face, despite the cold I felt. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging on a low branch, swaying gently without any wind, was a red adhesive tape. My first instinct was relief. Maybe it was a trail marker. But then I remembered the rumors about Aokigahara, about people who came to the forest too. Well, not to return. Some left tapes to mark the way, in case they changed their minds. I stood paralyzed, looking at that tape, imagining the story behind it. The whispers seemed to increase in volume, as if reacting to my discovery. Part of me wanted to run in the opposite direction, but something told me that tape could be my only chance to get out of there. With trembling hands, I touched the tape. It was cold to the touch, as if it had been placed there a long time ago. Swallowing hard, I made a decision. I would follow the trail left by this mysterious tape, praying it would lead me back to civilization. With my heart racing, I began to follow the trail of the red tape. Every few meters, I found a new piece tied to branches or trunks. As I advanced, the whispers seemed to intensify, as if the forest was reacting to my decision. Sometimes I had the impression of seeing movements out of the corner of my eye, shadows that moved in an unnatural way. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing but the motionless trees. Time seemed distorted. I couldn't tell if I had been walking for minutes or hours. My feet ached, and my throat was dry, but fear prevented me from stopping to rest or drink water. The tape trail led me through parts of the forest that seemed increasingly dense and dark. At one point, I passed through a clearing where several trees formed an almost perfect circle. In the center, there was a small pile of stones stacked in a clearly intentional manner. I felt a chill down my spine imagining who could have done that and why. The whispers, which until then had seemed distant, suddenly sounded as if they were right beside me. I spun quickly, expecting to see someone, but I was alone. Or at least that's how it seemed. At that moment, I was absolutely certain that I was being watched. Not by animals or other humans, but by something I couldn't understand. I quickened my pace, almost running now, desperate to get out of that clearing and continue following the red tapes. As I followed the tapes, I noticed that they began to appear more frequently. This gave me momentary hope that I was approaching the exit. However, this hope was quickly replaced by a new terror. The tapes were not only more frequent, but also more recent. Some seemed to have been placed a short time ago, still bright and without signs of wear. My mind began to spin with frightening possibilities. Was someone placing these tapes now? Was I following someone? Or was something guiding me? Twilight began to set in, making the forest even more gloomy. The sounds around me changed subtly. The whispers, previously indistinct, now seemed to form almost comprehensible words, as if they were on the verge of making sense. I tried to ignore them, focusing only on following the tapes, one foot in front of the other. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack behind me, as if a branch had been stepped on. I turned abruptly, my heart almost jumping out of my mouth. For an instant, I swear I saw a dark figure moving among the trees. But when I blinked, it had disappeared. It was becoming difficult to distinguish what was real and what was a product of my fear and exhaustion. At that moment, I realized I had two options: continue following the tapes in the hope of finding the exit, or try to spend the night in the forest. The idea of staying there in the dark was unbearable, so gathering all the courage I had left, I decided to continue. As darkness deepened, I took my flashlight out of my backpack. The beam of light seemed strangely weak, as if the darkness of the forest itself was swallowing it. The red tapes glowed almost supernaturally under the light, guiding me along an increasingly winding path. The whispers were now constant, a chorus of indistinct voices that seemed to come from all sides. I tried to concentrate only on the next step, the next tape, ignoring the fear that threatened to paralyze me. That's when I saw something that made my heart almost stop. Ahead, hanging on a tree, was a tape being tied at that very moment. I froze in place, unable to move or make any sound. The figure tying the tape had its back to me, partially hidden by shadows. It was clearly human in form, but there was something wrong, something I couldn't define. As I watched, paralyzed, the figure finished tying the tape and began to turn slowly in my direction. At that moment, an irrational panic took over me. Before I could see its face, I instinctively turned off the flashlight and threw myself behind a thick tree. My heart was beating so hard that I was sure it could be heard. I closed my eyes tightly, praying not to be discovered. The seconds dragged on like hours. When I finally gathered the courage to peek, the figure had disappeared. In the place where it had been, a new red tape swayed gently. Shaking uncontrollably, I stood motionless for several minutes, unable to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run in the opposite direction, abandon the tape trail, and try to find another way out of the forest. But an inner voice, perhaps the last vestige of rationality, told me that following the tapes was still my best chance. With shaky legs, I forced myself to continue. Each step was a struggle against paralyzing fear. The whispers had transformed into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others laughing, all incomprehensible, but terribly familiar. I no longer knew if they were real or if my mind was creating them. Suddenly, I saw a faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, but as I approached, I realized it was real lights. Real lights. With a final surge of adrenaline, I ran towards them, stumbling and scratching myself on low branches. I emerged from the forest so abruptly that I almost fell. I was on a road. Cars were passing, their headlights cutting through the darkness. I fell to my knees, exhausted and relieved, tears streaming down my face. When I looked back, the forest seemed normal, silent. There were no more whispers, no feeling of being watched. It was as if it had all been a nightmare from which I had finally awakened. A car stopped, the driver asking if I was okay. As he helped me into the vehicle, I promised myself I would never return to that forest. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The memories of that experience haunt me, and silence, which I used to appreciate, now fills me with inexplicable terror. I never thought a simple documentary project could turn my life upside down. It was supposed to be just another job, you know. I'd heard about these legends about the nearby forest, some really bizarre stories people tell. I decided to make a short film about it, thought it'd be interesting to show how these urban legends affect people. But man, what happened there? I still can't explain it. I'm shaking just remembering, and it's been almost a month. I arrived at the forest on a Saturday morning, very early. It was a bit cloudy, perfect weather for filming, I thought. I brought my camera, a tripod, some water bottles, and snacks. Nothing special. It was supposed to be just a few hours of recording. Little did I know. I entered the main trail and started filming. At first, everything was calm, you know. I was narrating the legends I had researched, showing the places people said were haunted. But after about 40 minutes of walking, I started to feel something strange. It was as if, I don't know, as if someone was watching me. Have you ever had that feeling? It's horrible. I looked around, trying to calm myself down. It's just my imagination, I thought. After all, I was alone there, right? But that feeling wouldn't go away. I kept walking, trying to focus on the filming. That's when things got even weirder. I was reviewing some footage I had just shot when I noticed some shadows on the screen. Shadows that I swear I hadn't seen when I was filming. At first, I thought it was some reflection, you know. But the more I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't normal. They were like silhouettes, a bit blurry, but definitely not trees or animals. My heart was in my mouth. I looked around again, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the forest, the trees, the sound of birds. But on the camera, man, on the camera there was something there. I decided to keep walking, kind of wanting to convince myself it was just a camera error or something. But that feeling of being watched only got worse. It was as if the entire forest had changed. The air seemed heavier, the sounds more muffled. I started to feel a chill in my stomach, you know. That chill we feel when we realize something is very wrong. I kept walking, but now each step was a challenge. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what was happening. That's when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, a little off the trail, was a small altar. It wasn't elaborate, you know. It looked like it had been made in a hurry. There were some faded photos, some melted candles, and what looked like an old diary. I stood there paralyzed, staring at it. Who could have done this? And why? My heart was racing, and I felt like I had discovered something I shouldn't have. I approached slowly, the camera still on in my hands. When I got close to the altar, I felt such a strong shiver that I almost dropped the camera. It was as if the air around had suddenly turned cold. I focused on the photos and objects. You could see they were personal things, you know, as if someone had left a part of themselves there. That's when I remembered the stories about Ray that I had researched. These lost spirits trapped between worlds. Was this it? Was I facing something that went far beyond the legends I came to investigate? I stood there, looking at the altar, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to run away, but another part, I don't know, felt like I needed to understand what was happening. I picked up the diary carefully, my hands shaking. When I opened it, I saw it was written in Japanese. I don't understand the language at all, but you could tell it was a personal diary. The pages were yellowed, the ink a bit smudged in some places. I flipped through it quickly and saw some dates. The last entry was from about 30 years ago. Man, that gave me chills. Who was this person? What had happened to them? While I was there, trying to process all of that, I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, you know. It was more like a whisper, very soft. I looked around but saw nothing. Then it happened again. It was as if someone was talking very close to my ear, but I couldn't understand what was being said. My whole body got goosebumps. I knew I wasn't alone there, but I couldn't see anyone. I grabbed the camera and started filming around, turning slowly. That's when I saw it. On the camera screen, right in the corner, there was a figure. It was like a shadow, but it had a human form. I couldn't see details, but I could swear it was looking directly at me. My heart almost stopped. I froze, staring at the camera screen, unable to believe what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it was watching me. It was such a strong, real sensation. I lowered the camera for a second, looking directly at the place where the figure appeared on the screen. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see with the naked eye. But when I raised the camera again, there it was. That's when I realized this thing, whatever it was, only appeared through the lens. I don't know how long I stood there, alternating between looking directly and through the camera. My mind was a mess, trying to understand what was happening. Was it a trick of the light? Some camera defect? Or was I really seeing something supernatural? As I struggled with these thoughts, the temperature around me seemed to drop even more. The air became so dense that I was having trouble breathing. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was like a distant cry, kind of muffled. It came from all directions and from nowhere at the same time. That cry, man, it was chilling. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to be everywhere. I turned around, trying to find the source, but it was impossible. The camera was shaking in my hands, and I realized I was crying too, without even noticing. The fear I felt at that moment, I can't even explain. It was as if all the weight of that forest, all the sad stories, all the loneliness, had fallen on me at once. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed there, between the altar and that invisible presence. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The photos on the altar, which were faded before, now seemed alive. The colors were stronger, and I could swear the faces in the photos were moving subtly. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was going crazy. But no, it was real. Or at least it seemed real to me at that moment. One photo in particular caught my attention. It was of a young woman with a sad smile. And her eyes. Man, her eyes seemed to follow me, no matter what angle I looked from. That's when I realized the figure I saw on the camera and this woman in the photo, they were the same person. At that moment, I felt as if time had stopped. The crying around me got louder, clearer, and suddenly, I understood that it wasn't a cry of sadness, but of relief. As if that presence, that woman, had been waiting for so long for someone to find her. Without thinking, I reached out towards the photo. The moment my fingers touched the image, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Sadness, loneliness, but also gratitude. It was as if, for a brief moment, I could feel everything that woman had gone through, and then, as quickly as it started, everything stopped. The crying ceased, the cold sensation disappeared, and the forest returned to normal. I looked at the camera and the figure was gone. The photos on the altar went back to being just old, faded photos. I stood there motionless, for I don't know how long, trying to process what had happened. When I finally managed to move, I grabbed my things and ran out of there. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that forest. I've reviewed the footage 1,000 times, but none of that appears. It's as if it had been a dream, you know. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That experience changed something in me. It made me realize that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding. And sometimes all we can do is accept the mystery and move on, carrying with us the stories of those who can no longer tell them. I still tremble just remembering what happened to us in the Aokigahara Forest. It was 2 weeks ago, but it feels like yesterday. It was supposed to be just another weekend adventure, you know. We were super excited to go on a hike and then camp. Me, Ethan, Olivia, and Noah, we always loved these nature things. But nothing could have prepared us for what we experienced there. Look, I've done many trails in my life, but this was different. We arrived early, the day was beautiful, with a nice sun. I even joked, guys, today's perfect for us to get lost, huh? Little did I know. We started the trail calmly, Ethan all proud of his new compass. With this, we won't get lost even if we want to, he said. Oh, if he only knew. At first, everything was normal. The forest is really beautiful. All that green, the silence. But after about 2 hours of walking, things started to get weird. Like, very weird. Ethan's compass began to go crazy. It kept spinning non-stop, pointing in all directions. We thought it was defective, obviously. But then Olivia took out her phone to use the GPS, and nothing. No signal at all. That's when that first chill hit my stomach, you know. That feeling that something's wrong, but you don't know it yet. We try not to panic, you know. Like, we're adults. We've done this before. There's no reason to freak out, right? Noah, who was always the coolest head in the group, suggested we try to orient ourselves using natural landmarks. You know, like the sun, the tallest trees, that kind of thing. It seemed like a good idea at the time. We started paying more attention to the environment, trying to find something that stood out. But man, the more we looked, the more everything seemed the same. It was as if the forest had swallowed anything that could help us get out of there. Time passed, and we kept walking. The sun was starting to set, and that late afternoon chill was coming. But it wasn't just the cold weather. It was a different kind of cold, you know? Something icy inside. Olivia was the first to say out loud what everyone was thinking. Guys, we're walking in circles, and that's when it hit us. We stopped and looked around. Everything seemed familiar, but at the same time totally strange. It was as if the forest had changed, but without changing, you know? Like the trees were the same, but they seemed to be in different places. You couldn't explain it, but you could feel it. That place was playing with us, and it wasn't a fun game. The worst part was that we had no choice but to keep walking. It was getting dark, and the idea of staying still in the middle of nowhere was even scarier. Ethan had the idea of using the colored ribbons we had brought to mark the path. At least that way, we'd know if we were passing through the same place again. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but I agreed. We started tying ribbons to the trees as we walked. Red, blue, green. It was like we were leaving breadcrumbs in a crazy forest. Man, it was the longest night of my life. Darkness fell quickly, as if it had swallowed everything at once. We turned on the flashlights, but the light didn't seem to go very far. It was as if the darkness was solid, you know? And the sounds. My God, the sounds. The forest that was silent during the day turned into a bizarre concert at night. Noises I had never heard before, as if nature had come to life. We tried to talk to stay calm, but our voices seemed muffled, as if the forest didn't want us to speak. And the worst part, after hours of walking, we came face to face with one of our ribbons. It was there, swinging on a tree, as if laughing at us. We had returned to the same place again. That's when despair really hit. Olivia started crying softly. Noah had that look of someone trying not to freak out. And Ethan. Man, I've never seen him so pale. Me? I was in shock. Like, how was this possible? We had walked in a straight line, I'm sure. But there was the ribbon, proving we were stuck in a crazy loop. We decided to stop right there and wait for the day to clear. Nobody said it, but you could feel that everyone was afraid that if we kept walking, we might get even further from the exit. We improvised a camp right there, in the middle of that darkness. We tried to light a fire, but the branches seemed not to want to catch fire, as if even they were conspiring against us. We ended up all huddled together, trying to keep warm. Nobody could sleep properly. Every noise, every movement of the shadows made us jump. I kept looking at the sky, trying to see the stars between the treetops, but it was as if even they had disappeared. Time seemed to stand still. I kept checking my watch every 5 minutes, but the hands seemed to drag. It was the longest night of my life, full of thoughts about what could happen if we couldn't get out of there. When the first ray of sun finally appeared, it was as if we had been reborn. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, you know? But we didn't let our guard down. Noah suggested we try climbing a tree to get a better view. I thought it was risky, but he insisted. While he climbed, Olivia, Ethan, and I stayed down below, anxious. Suddenly, he shouted from above, "Guys, I think I see a clearing." It was a mix of relief and distrust. Was it real or just another illusion of that crazy forest? We decided to risk it and follow the direction Noah indicated. This time, in addition to the ribbons, we started making marks on the trees too. You know that feeling that someone's watching you? That's exactly what I felt as we walked. The branches seemed to move on their own. The shadows danced in a strange way. But we pressed on, kind of pushing each other not to give up. After what seemed like an eternity, the light started to get stronger between the trees. Heart pounding, legs shaking, we approached. And then, suddenly, there it was, the exit from the forest. Man, when we finally stepped out of that forest, it was like coming out of a nightmare. We hugged, cried, laughed, all at the same time. It was a mixture of relief and disbelief. Looking from the outside, the forest seemed so normal, as if none of that had happened. But all you had to do was look at each other's faces to know it was real. We were dirty, tired, with sunken eyes from not sleeping, but alive. Alive and out of that place. The weirdest thing is that when we finally managed to check our phones, we discovered that only one day had passed. One day. To us, it felt like it had been an eternity. And Ethan's compass, it started working normally as soon as we left the forest. We stood there for a while, not knowing exactly what to do. It was as if we had come out of a completely different world and now needed to learn to live again in the real world. Nobody said anything, but you could see it in everyone's eyes. We would never be the same after that experience. It's been 2 weeks since all this happened, and I still can't quite understand what happened. We talked a lot about it, trying to find some logical explanation. Was it fatigue? Some natural gas in the forest that made us hallucinate? Or is Aokigahara really a different place? I've never been one to believe in these supernatural things, but after what we experienced, you can't simply ignore it. Ethan even researched similar cases in the region, and man, there are a lot of strange stories out there. People who lost track of time, compasses that went crazy, feelings of being watched. It's scary to think we weren't the only ones. The craziest thing is how this experience changed us. Like, we still enjoy nature and all, but now we have a different respect, you know? A healthy fear. Whenever we get together, the conversation always goes back to that day. We try to laugh, make jokes, but deep down, everyone knows it was something serious. Something we'll never forget. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I close my eyes, and I swear I can still hear those strange forest sounds. It's as if a part of that experience has stayed with us forever. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened in that forest, but one thing I'm sure of, there are things in this world that go beyond our understanding, and Aokigahara holds secrets that maybe it's better to leave in peace.